Good morning, booktubers, readers, watchers, YouTubers, writers, and anyone who happened to come across this channel. I am reviewing, I think this is attempt number 3, My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. I finished this rather nice little penguin with a photograph of a damselfly or dragonfly by Grace Thompson on the front, and I finished that 3 or 4 days ago now. It's hard to review those books that you really love, and as you can tell from the condition of this one, it has been well loved. Nor is it the first in its line. This is about the 3rd such book that I've ever owned. My very first one, which I appropriated from my parents' bookshelf, is this gorgeous little penguin book with its amazing illustrations. I've been reading this since I was about 10 or 11. I don't remember the exact time I first picked it up, but when I did, I was roughly contemporary with Jerry himself, and Jerry in this book starts off as 10 years old. The illustrations are by Ralph Thompson, and they are delightful. Now, Gerald Durrell, for anyone who doesn't know, was an English author, but he wasn't primarily an author. He started writing books at the instigation of his wife to raise money for what his primary occupation was, which was animal collector and conservation. He started off from that career, arguably, when he was 2 years old. At one point in this book, when one of his brothers, Larry, I believe, is complaining about animals being brought into the house, and there's this family argument over Jerry's various acquisitions, Larry says, I wouldn't mind so much if it wasn't just a phase, he'll grow out of it. And Jerry's mother says rather tartly, well, he's been in this phase since the age of 2 and he shows no signs of growing out of it. This is a funny book. I don't read a lot of comedy. I read a little bit of satire, but this is humorous. It's funny enough that even all these years and decades after reading it so many times, I will still occasionally be caught by surprise and give a little laugh out loud, a real one. And it is delightful. So not the first book that he wrote, but it is the book that is first in his personal timeline as far as I know. At the beginning of this book, he's 10 years old, and him and his family, his 2 older brothers, an older sister, and his mother are sitting around in some house in cold, wet, miserable, rainy England. It's nasty, people have colds, and describes the scene that set the way for them all moving to Greece, to Corfu. And then they did that. It's incredibly funny, off-the-cuff humour, light-hearted, and Gerald Durrell had this, I'm still crying over that. He had this marvellous way of seeing the humour, the ridiculousness, the absurdity of something and describing it with joy, so that you, as a reader, have fun with that. There doesn't seem to be any judgment, there doesn't seem to be any undue criticism. It's just the humour of the situation and a shining example of a book that will leave you feeling happy every time you read it and every time you finish one. Which is amazing. There's not many books that I enjoy that are like that. Now, from the England segment, they go off to Corfu. There's a funny little segment of them living in a hotel in the city before they move to their own villa. And there the family all start settling down in their different ways. The oldest brother, Larry, is a writer, and he builds bookshelves, moves books there and starts writing. The second eldest brother is Leslie. He's a hunter enthusiast. He's got guns everywhere, and his joy in life is hunting at various points in this book, and I think the other ones. That may upset some people. I'm a little bit more critical of that now than I was when I was 10 or 11 years old and first read this. His sister and his mother, they all start settling in. But for Jerry, settling in means starting to explore the wondrous world that is this Greek island and all the animals that live in it. Everything from turtles to dogs to bats, geckos, insects, aquatic life, everything is grist for his mill. And as over the 2 or 3 years that they spend in Corfu, he encounters a few other people who help him become an undergraduate, if you will, a child, conservationist, collector, because collecting was a bit more of a thing back then than it is now. So Gerald Durrell is known internationally as a conservationist these days, and he started a zoo on the island of Jersey. So zoologist, conservationist, back in his day they'd have called it a naturalist. I believe that's a word that means different things in other countries and may be open to misinterpretation. But yes, so this is my third attempt to review this book. One of those books that you love so much you struggle to find the things that might interest other people who haven't been reading it off and on since they were 10 years old. The first book in his personal sequence starting when he was 10, but by no means the first book that he'd written. So when he was in his early 20s, Gerald Durrell inherited some money from his father, who had died when I think he was 3 or 5, and I believe in India. Gerald's father doesn't come into the narrative very much at all because essentially he didn't know him very well, and his absence was less momentous, I suppose, in his life than most people losing their father at a young age. Having come into that inheritance, he used it to become an animal collector around the world, and one of his first books dealt with that. The Overloaded Ark came out in 1953, and I believe that was the first book he wrote. And I don't believe that he set out to become an author. He set out to collect animals. But that was an expensive proposition. And his wife at the time, Jackie, I believe, allegedly, convinced him that by writing a book, he would be able to get some money to help him in his various collections. Now, if the internet can be believed, which of course we have to believe the internet, right? This is actually the 6th book he'd written. I've read most of the others. I might have missed one. The Overloaded Ark was the first. And from what I remember, it was a little bit less polished. The book before this one was The Drunken Forest, which I used to own and love. And this one, the first one in the Corfu trilogy, as they call it these days, is incredibly polished. It is beautiful. Its sequences are immaculate. You realize that it's moving from timelines, and there's one point where I believe that it moves back along the timeline from the beginning of the Corfu adventure to the end of the Corfu adventure. There's one sequence which I believe moves back to a previous timeline because he describes his timelines essentially Angry Bird in terms of the villas they're living in. And the first villa is Strawberry Red Villa, and I believe that he comes back to that later in the story. The stories are anecdotal, and the anecdotes vary between his family, other various amazing characters and events that occur on Corfu, and animals. Looking for animals, finding animals, describing animals. The main thing that keeps me coming back to this book again and again, as well as the sense of joy, the fascination in the animals, because I too was fascinated by animals as a kid, is how incredibly gorgeous the writing actually is. Now, of course, Gerald Durrell grew up in a writing family. His brother was an author. Sure, whatever. I still love animals, you see. I get bitten and I go back for more. So my family and other animals... One of the things about it, being bitten by birds, is that as a child being fascinated by animals as well, I would spend heaps of time out in nature just staring at animals. I didn't have anywhere near Gerald's systemic observation or his notebooks or his collecting equipment. I certainly had less patience from family and friends than he did. But I was full of admiration for this as a 10 or 11-year-old. And now, as a much older person, I am still full of admiration for the beauty of the writing. So, on page 82, he writes, "Eventually the warm wind and the rain of winter seemed to polish the day, so that when January arrived it shone a clear, tender blue, the same blue as that of the tiny flames that devoured the olive logs and the charcoal pits. The nights were still and cool, with the moon so fragile it barely freckled the sea with silver points. The dawns were pale, and translucent until the sun rose, mist-wrapped like a gigantic silkworm cocoon, and washed the island with a delicate bloom of gold dust. That, to me, is pure literature. It's as beautiful as any of the great writers, in my opinion, and it always uses some sort of animal simile. Like, I have never heard anyone else compare the sun with a silkworm cocoon, but Gerald Durrell does it so well. Anyway, I read this book slowly with enjoyment once again, and it's been a few decades since I last read it. Another element to it now, for those of you on YouTube a lot, you may have encountered Frank, who makes the most hysterically funny stories about animals and what they do. He himself is cracking up even as he does them. Gerald Durrell had some element of that in the way he observed animals and talked about them as well throughout all his books. I found that, which is one of the things I found so enjoyable and intriguing as a younger person. So on page 203 he writes, I had for some time been intrigued by the breeding habits of the mantids. I had watched the unfortunate male crouching on the back of a female who, with complete equanimity, was browsing on him over her shoulder. That observation, flawless ability to communicate his fascination, joy, and enjoyment of the world around him runs through all his books. Now, why am I reading this book now? There's the question. For years, I have carefully coddled this book so that it has disintegrated, it's true, but so that I don't lose the bits, that I can read them still as one. And I bought other books so that to limit the disintegration of this one, and here on the back is a very young, very, very young Gerald Durrell, presumably in his late 20s when he wrote this one. Actually, maybe 30s. Still, from my point of view, a young man. Now, I hadn't read My Family, reread My Family and Other Animals for quite a long time. A few years ago, I think it is now, a movie came out called The Durrells of Corfu, based on this book, or this was book based on the movie. I'm not sure which. Anyway, Michael Haig wrote that, and I did not get to see the movie for one reason or another. People who did came back to me and went, you like Gerald Durrell, all his books are lies, nothing happened that way, that wasn't like this, blah, 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 blah. And I'm going, it's a book, it's pretty, I liked it. And the other day I picked up The Durrells of Corfu, thinking maybe it's time for me to read this. And I thought, no, I want to read the actual books first. These are the actual books to me. These are why I'm interested. If it wasn't for Gerald Durrell, I would never have picked up The Durrells of Corfu, because while I like Lawrence Durrell's writing okay, I find it a little bit over the top at times and can be quite pretentious, much like the Larry Durrell portrayed in these books, I might add. It's Gerald Durrell that will get me to that book, if anything does, and I wanted his version first. Now, for those of you who did watch The Durrells of Corfu or have already read that book, you're probably doing the same thing now. You're probably saying, his statements here weren't true. Why didn't he talk about his father dying or his mother potentially being an alcoholic? I think Margot had some sort of syndrome, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter that his brother was married at the time and he never mentions his wife. Actually, I think that's very respectable, not to mention those things that might cause harm or misery to the people involved or other people who knew them. He was writing his story. And while he doesn't answer those questions in this book in any way, in the introduction or anything, that's because it was written a long before those accusations came out. He does dedicate this book to my mother, and he starts it off, in the first list of contents is the speech for the defense, in which he talks about why he wrote it and what it was about from his point of view. Oh, there you go, I was wrong. This is the story of a 5-year sojourn that I and my family made on the Greek island of Corfu. It was originally intended to be a mildly nostalgic account of the natural history of the island, but I made a grave mistake of introducing my family into the book in the first few pages. Having got themselves on paper, they then proceeded to establish themselves, invite various friends to share the chapters. and it was only with the greatest difficulty and by exercising considerable cunning that I managed to retain a few pages here and there which I could devote exclusively to animals. This is his book. This is how he saw it. He wrote it to be an enjoyable book, and it is delightful. Unabashedly delightful. And if some of the elements aren't true, well, truth tends to be a bit fluid from person to person. Having finished My Family and Other Animals with a smile on my face, thorough enjoyment, what I really wanted to do was go on to Birds, Beasts and Relatives, second in the Corfu history. And I would have done just that if my copy, which was also a penguin with a donkey on the front, hadn't completely disintegrated over a decade ago. I'm now on the hunt for another copy. It may take some time. And The Garden of the Gods, which is the third in the trilogy, I haven't owned that, I think, ever, though I have read it on one occasion. So I personally need inside myself to read Birds, Beasts and Relatives before I do the Durrells of Corfu. I would like to read a few more Durrells. I think this might be the year where I read more and more of the Durrells, or at least those ones that I still own. I looked down his list of writing and there's heaps of them, and I don't own most of those anymore. If I ever get to England, I'm going to investigate some of those amazing bookshops, which Jules Burt keeps showing me, full of penguins, because most Durrell was in penguins. Anyway, thank you for watching. As I said, it's been a few days since I finished that book. I am doing my best to go through a Ron Goulart at the moment, which is less easy than My Family and Other Animals, which I thoroughly recommend, because in every sense, whether you love animals or not, whether you like comic writing or not, whether you like weird, liminal, niche events or not, I feel like that there is something in this book for everyone. And if you happen to come across this copy, you get to look at these wonderful, wonderful illustrations every time you pick it up. So, thank you for watching. Read good books. Have a great day.